From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Ophthalmology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Ophthalmology.
Hello, and welcome to our listeners around the world. You're listening to JAMA Ophthalmology Author Interviews, and thank you for joining us. I'm Neil Bressler, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA Ophthalmology. Today we're going to look at a cohort study at the Department of Kinesiology at the School of Public Health that's within the University of Nevada in Reno, where they have been investigating smooth pursuit velocity after a season of repetitive head impacts in American football players. And joining me is the corresponding author of that report, Dr. Nicholas Murray. Dr. Murray is director of the Neuromechanics Lab at the University of Nevada. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Maybe we could start, as we're approaching football season in the United States and other places around the world, with a little brief background on something that many people may have heard about but maybe aren't so familiar with, and that is these repetitive head impacts that can occur in American football players. What do we know about this prior to this study, just in general?
Sure, that's an excellent question. So repetitive head impacts are essentially the blows that athletes take to their head, neck area, and they generally don't elicit any clinical signs or symptoms of what we consider a traditional concussion. We don't really know how they impact the brain, but we do know in certain studies, in certain cohorts, and certain groups of individuals that they can have some negative effects. And with the rise of concern of CTE and other type of neurological trauma, we definitely are interested in, if you take blows to your head, can it lead to later life impairments? And one of the things that we definitely wanted to do was to take a little piece of that pie and study to see, okay, what happens in a single season? Can we see some of these potential deficits with some more sensitive eye tracking metrics to try to quantify that?
And before we get into that, CTE, just for our non-neurology folk that are listening?
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And that's generally more, you would look at the Boston group and Ann McKee's excellent work for that. We don't really measure that here because we're more in the acute trauma center and taking a look at how things are occurring really quickly after they do have a concussion. But there is some concern that the more contact years of sports that you play, the possibilities of later life issues do come in a little bit more frequently.
So now you're going to look at these associations of head impacts with some ocular muscle movements, specifically smooth pursuit velocity. Had that been done before, and why were you looking at that particular ocular movement?
Sure. In terms of repetitive head impacts, there's been some decent amount of work that myself, a few co-authors, and others have looked at, but it's really centered around imaging. And then it's also centered around clinical tests and pretty much the standardized guidelines of how we evaluate concussions. When we get into the more sensitive tools like postural stability and eye tracking, there are subtle deficits that we can start to see. And we've seen some of that in our previous literature as well. We, as a group, and some of my co-authors, we've been doing some eye tracking. I've been doing it since my entirety in my PhD and after for the last 12 to 14 years. And it always brings up really interesting questions about the health of the brain. And so in this particular element, we were really interested in what happens with smooth pursuit eye movement. When you're tracking something, these are what you use all the time. You use eye movements all day long, but smooth pursuit is that very basic rudimentary element when you're tracking someone moving just past you nice and slow, or you're scanning something, and it really can give you an idea on how you can perceive your environment. And that perception is vitally important to understanding how to navigate your environment. Essentially, if you can't see an object, you don't know it's there, and you can't move out of the way if you need to move out of the way. And so we really wanted to study it. There really has not been that much done in the eye tracking literature on repetitive head impacts. And so we thought it was a nice bridge because we do have that background and we've done it before with concussed patients, and we wanted to say, hey, what does it look like in these individuals that hit their head often and frequently but do not have a concussion?
So are you using some sort of scientific evaluation? I think of smooth muscle velocity as, here's my finger, follow me going to the right or follow me going to the left. Are you doing something like that only in a much more accurate, defined scientific way?
Yes. With traditional eye tracking, it's really heavily dependent upon the stimuli that you use. That's how you're going to evaluate the metrics. And so if you were to imagine, for what we did is we actually have a perception task where there's a C that moves across the screen and they track it during a specific velocity. And during that, the C would change its location, either being up, down, left, right. The stimuli is called a Landolt C. And they would record, did they see the C and where was the opening of the C, in order to gain a deeper understanding of not only their eye movements and the perception. This particular study didn't publish on the perception work, and we really are focusing just on the actual eye movements themselves. But that's more the traditional paradigm. There's a lot more like sinusoidal waves and radial elements that are a little bit more well understood and well recorded, but we took it a little bit different and wanted to look at perception alongside it. And so our main stimuli was, again, that slow-moving C as it moves across the screen.
So who did you look at? Who are these American football players? Are these in high school? Are they college, professional? Are they male and female? Who was the group you were looking at?
So it's Division I football players here at the University of Nevada, Reno, studying some different cohorts of them. And what makes this study interesting and unique is that we do know in contact sports, especially at the Division I collegiate level, where there's a pretty high level of competition, bowl games are important in those type of records. We know these individuals do play at a high level and hit their head often. And so that was the target, because hopefully in the future, if we find things that are useful and interesting, we can filter that down and to begin studying more adolescent-based populations.
So I get now how you had them follow this Landolt C in your laboratory. How did you determine how many head impacts they had, if that's the association with how well they do on this, let's say, smooth pursuit velocity?
One of the unique portions of this study is that we measured each one of their head impacts. And having come from this space, if you're not familiar with it, there's an older system called the HITS, where we used to put sensors inside the helmets, and then we would fit the helmet to the athlete, and they would go out and play, and then we would record any of the head impacts to that region. Now, what we used was instrumented mouth guards, which are just so cool. You probably may have seen them if you're familiar with some of the World Rugby going on and the blinking lights and things of that nature. Very similar technology, but it has a series of sensors inside the actual mouth guard that record a certain amount of time every time there is an impact to the head, neck, or body that exceeds the thresholds and the parameters for it to record information. So we would then get data from each of those athletes. They'd wear it at every single session. And then the more laborious part, which is a lot of extra work on our side, we would go through and independently video verify the head impacts. And now this study, because it was over an entire year, we couldn't do it for every single session, but we did it for a random sample to verify that, yes, our sensors are accurately tracking the amount of head impacts that they take during a game or a practice.
And did you only look at people that were American football players having these head impacts, or was it some of the coaches or the staff or other athletes that don't get head impacts?
Just the American football players. We do have a control group in this study, but they were just healthy, average collegiate students that were closely matched in age. So they didn't wear the mouth guard walking around campus, although that would be a very interesting side study.
Okay, so I believe I have a good understanding now. You're going to look at these smooth pursuit velocities following this Landolt C. That will give you an idea if there's an association with their performance of that on their repetitive head impacts. How many people did you look at, and what'd you find?
So in this particular study, in this published study, we had 25 Division I football players, which were broken into a couple different groups, and I'll explain that. And then we also had 10 healthy non-contact controls, which were 7 recreationally active individuals and 3 non-contact NC2A swimmers. because we wanted to include at least some other non-contact players into this. The football players, which is a little different than other studies, following a couple other articles, we actually across the season recorded all their head impacts and then created two groups, a high dose group and a low dose group. And the high dose group is the folks who took the most blows at the highest magnitude consistently across the entire season. And so we said, great, it may not just be those folks. Maybe we've got some scout team guys that don't play as many reps, second string, third string. These are the players who are not on the field consistently and as often as possible. And we wanted to see in that own cohort itself, not only do they all hit their head and do we have issues, or what happens when the high group is compared to the low group.
And what did you find?
So what we found is basically there's no effect realistically. There are some more nuanced findings, but it appears, at least in this particular sample, smooth pursuit velocity is not impacted in repetitive head impacts.
Now, could that be a false negative? That is, you didn't look at enough people, or maybe the Landolt-C design isn't sensitive enough to pick it up? Or do you have some relative confidence that at least that parameter is not affected by repetitive head impacts?
I definitely think there can be, obviously, any type of errors that do occur from it. 25 individuals, and when we break it down into the high and low dose groups, they are smaller sample sizes. But if you have worked with this technology, getting a whole team to do it and buy in and use it is an extreme undertaking. But we were sufficiently powered to see some sort of an effect, which was important. However, I do think that the smooth pursuit velocity isn't exactly the best approach now, just having looked in retrospect. I think smooth pursuit gain is more appropriate and more clinically applicable. And gain is essentially the ratio of the stimuli and then how well your eyes are tracking that. So the velocity of the stimuli divided by the velocity of the eye, and it gives you that gain value. Ours was, we stuck to the velocity mostly because we wanted to really take it one chunk at a time. So we think that's a better metric moving forward. And there's a lot of nuances we didn't also look at, like saccadic intrusions during smooth pursuits, the actual perception, how well did they score on the actual Landolt-C task itself? That could give us more information. Hopefully those other pieces will be coming here shortly in the next few months, depending on all the various things we got to get done. But I absolutely do think that there's something else underlying. There's a story to be told. And I really think that it's actually found in the high dose performers, those who hit their head most often, because at the beginning of the season, they actually have slower smooth pursuit velocities compared to the low dose group. And just the controls, not the low dose group. And I think that's fascinating because it shows us that these football players who are high impact players who hit their head often and frequently, that's probably a normal behavior for them. And that's something they've been doing in their career for quite some time. You don't get into Division I football on chance. It's one of those things you have to work very hard to get at to, and not many make it. And so we don't know the other parameters of how they played before. We don't know how many times they hit their head before. We don't know those pieces of information. So they could already be starting the season with some sort of deficit that is being observed, and it is carried over and not only maintained throughout the season, but not getting better.
And as you say, can this study determine that, or that's really a hypothesis that you're generating out of looking at this, and that may be something to look at in your next pursuits of evaluating these surrogates for potential damage to the brain from head impacts?
I would say that twofold. That definitely is a more of a further down the line hypothesis that we are actively studying. But secondly, one of the interesting pieces is that in these groups across time, we're not seeing an increase or a decrease. We're not seeing a significant time effect, meaning that these eye velocities are not changing across time. We would expect that they probably might improve actually in certain groups across a season as they train. When you play sports and you track objects like volleyball, baseball, those type of things, yes, fatigue and athletic performance can influence things across a season. But if you're training those eye movements, you probably should see some sort of improvement in it. And one of the interesting and fascinating things is that didn't occur in our high dose group. And as a matter of fact, their mean, although not significant, did begin to decline at the end of the season.
Got it. So does this change anything so far? Should we still think there's potential for some sort of brain damage and some sort of change in ocular movements with repetitive head impacts? Or has this not changed anything so far in our understanding? What's the effect when you're guiding neurologists, coaches, players in terms of this finding?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of these findings, I think that it's solidified some of the questions where, one, as a football fan and a former football player, now not at a very high level, high school, I think it's important to just help assuage some of the fears, saying that, yes, playing sports, especially contact sports, doesn't really have an immediate negative effect on your brain, at least that we can tell. Now, with that comes a double-edged sword. You're obviously at risk for other types of injuries, especially concussions. But I think that it puts us in the right direction to really start answering more important questions. Like one of them, if we look at some of the other data from different studies, the CARE Consortium, different groups, that realistically how many years of contact collision sports that you've played could be one of the keys more than anything else. And we may capture those at different times in the athletic performance. But realistically, I think our article tells us hitting your head often and frequently isn't always necessarily having a negative effect, and it isn't really creating acute trauma.
I think we can say that for these acute changes, it's nothing that we need to newly discover from what you had. For these chronic changes over time, those associations, I think, with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, et cetera, we have to still be concerned about. Listen, I want to thank you so much for sharing this with us. It really has been fascinating.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure and an honor.
I'm Neil Bressler, and I've been speaking with Dr. Nicholas Murray on a cohort study on smooth pursuit velocity ocular movements after a season of repetitive head impacts in American football players at the University of Nevada. You can find a link to the article in this episode's description. This episode is produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.